There's a particular silence that descends on a man when he realizes he's been a fool. Not the sharp, jarring silence of sudden shock. It's quieter than that. More suffocating, like the air itself has thickened, and the ordinary sounds of the world have all agreed to withdraw and leave him alone with what he's done. I know that silence well. I sat inside it for a very long time, on a Tuesday morning in February, holding a bank statement that had arrived in the post, the way bank statements always do, unremarkably, in a white envelope with a little transparent window, the kind of envelope that tells you nothing and changes everything. I was wearing a gray cotton shirt I'd had since before I retired. The ceiling fan above me was making a clicking sound on every rotation. It had been doing that for 3 months, and I'd kept telling myself I'd look at it, get someone in, tighten whatever needed tightening. I never did. I just learned to stop hearing it. That, I've come to understand, was the pattern, the early warning, the preview of everything else I trained myself not to notice. My name is Walter. I was a railway engineer for 35 years, most of them with Network Rail and its predecessors, working out of depots in Yorkshire and later in the East Midlands. I know what makes a system run. I understand schedules, tolerances, the logic of interconnected mechanisms, the way each component exists in relationship to every other component, the way a fault in one place will eventually, inevitably, express itself somewhere downstream. I spent my career trusting those systems. You set them up correctly, you perform your maintenance checks, and then you let them run. That's the philosophy. That's the discipline. You don't hover over a functioning mechanism. You trust the design. I retired at 67 with a pension lump sum of just over £280,000, and shortly after, I sold the terraced house in Beeston, where I'd lived alone since my divorce from Margaret in 2009. That sale brought another £65,000 after the mortgage was settled and the estate agent took their cut. So I had, in round numbers, roughly £340,000. Not a fortune by any modern reckoning, but in the context of my life, in the context of a man who'd grown up in a council house in Wakefield, with a father who worked the pit, and a mother who worked the tills at Quick Save, it was more money than I'd ever expected to hold at one time. I remember staring at the balance on my screen the day both payments cleared and thinking, almost guiltily, that I ought to do something sensible with it. That's when I started thinking about Thailand. I'd been twice before on organized tours, once in 2014 and again in 2017, both times through a travel company that organized these trips for retired railway workers, believe it or not. There's a fellowship in that profession, a kind of unspoken brotherhood of men who've spent decades watching the clock and obeying the schedule. And when the schedule ends, when the clock stops meaning anything, a lot of us find we don't quite know what to do with the freedom. Thailand had struck me both times as a place that didn't particularly care how you filled your hours. The heat was extraordinary. The food was astonishing. The pace of life in the places I'd visited, Chiang Mai on the first trip, Bangkok on the second, seemed to operate according to a different set of priorities entirely. People looked happy in ways that struck me as genuine and unperformed. I was attracted to that. I want to be honest about it. I was attracted to the happiness I saw there in a way I hadn't been attracted to anything in years. After Margaret, there'd been no serious relationships. Not from want of trying exactly, but from a creeping conviction that I'd somehow become unsuitable for companionship. I don't say that to generate sympathy. I say it because it's relevant. A lonely man with a lump sum in his pocket and a long-standing affection for a country that made him feel alive is not an unusual story. He's not even a particularly foolish story, on paper. The foolishness comes later. I arrived in Bangkok on a Tuesday in October. I know it was a Tuesday because the flight from Heathrow left on Monday night, and I'd been traveling long enough to lose the day by the time I landed. And I took a taxi to a serviced apartment I'd booked in the Ari neighborhood, which a colleague from my second trip had recommended as quieter than the Sukhumvit corridor and better for a man who wanted to actually sleep. The apartment was on the 8th floor and had a balcony that looked out over a tangle of wires and shophouses, and further off, the glittering upper floors of half a dozen towers. It was hot in a way that was immediately demanding, And I remember standing on that balcony at 6 in the morning, jet-lagged and oddly exhilarated, thinking that I had made the right decision, that this was what the second half of life was supposed to feel like. I met Kwan on my 4th day in Bangkok. This is the part of the story that people always want me to explain, as though the explanation will somehow reveal the specific stupidity that I exhibited, some identifiable flaw that they can confirm they don't share, some inoculation they can draw comfort from. So let me describe it without drama. I was at Krung Thep Aphiwat Central Terminal, the new station in Bang Sue, because I had taken the train up from central Bangkok out of professional habit, the way a man who spent his life among trains can't help himself from riding them. I wasn't looking for anything. I was looking at the architecture and the platform configuration and the signage systems and feeling the familiar professional pleasure of a well-designed piece of infrastructure. Kwan worked at one of the retail units on the commercial level of the station, a small shop that sold packaged snacks and bottled drinks and phone accessories. I stopped there because I was thirsty. She asked if I needed help finding something and spoke to me in clear, careful English, with a smile that I registered as warm and professional simultaneously. She was 28 years old, small and neat, with an easy confidence that didn't have anything obviously performative about it. We spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, about the station, about where I was from, about how long I'd worked with railways. She found that funny, in a way that seemed genuine rather than polite. An old British train man who'd come to Thailand and wandered into the newest station in Southeast Asia. She said her shift ended at 4. She said there was a good noodle place nearby if I hadn't eaten yet. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what was happening. I'm 72 years old, and I'd been to Bangkok twice before. I'm not a naive man about the general topology of how foreign men and Thai women sometimes meet. But, and this is the part that's harder to explain, the part that requires honesty, it didn't feel like that. It felt like two people talking about trains and noodles. And sometimes it's exactly what it feels like, and sometimes it isn't. And the terrible thing is that in the moment, you can't always tell. We ate noodles. She told me about her family, her mother, her 2 younger sisters, a brother who'd recently been made redundant from a logistics company in Samut Prakan. She lived with her mother in Bang Sue. Her father had left when she was 12. She spoke about all of this without self-pity, and with what seemed to me like a practical dignity that I found genuinely admirable. I told her about the railway. I told her about Beeston. I told her about Margaret, briefly, the way you mention a difficult chapter that's closed. She listened well. I noticed that, the quality of her attention. I'm a man who has spent his adult life around other men, professional men who listen in a functional way, cataloging what's useful and discarding the rest. She listened differently. I know what I was. I know it now and I half knew it then. I was a 71-year-old widower equivalent, divorced, not widowed, but the emotional texture isn't so different when the outcome is the same, who had arrived in a warm country with more money than I knew what to do with, and a loneliness I'd stopped bothering to name because naming it felt like weakness. I was the sort of man cautionary tales are written for. I just didn't think I was. That is, I suspect, the universal condition of men who end up in cautionary tales. Nobody casts himself as the cautionary figure in his own story. He's always the exception. He always has his reasons. Over the following 3 weeks, Kwan and I met regularly. She showed me parts of Bangkok I hadn't seen on my previous visits. A floating market in the morning cool, a temple complex in the Dusit district, where monks moved in orange lines through the courtyards, a weekend market near Chatuchak, where she bargained cheerfully on my behalf and presented me with small items as gifts, a carved wooden keyring, a silk scarf in dark blue. These gestures were small enough to be unimpressive to a cynic, but large enough, in context, to feel like the vocabulary of genuine care. I was aware that I was being shown a curated version of something. I told myself that's all any early relationship ever is, a mutual performance of your best self. I told myself it was honest, as far as it went. I told myself a lot of things. I met her mother, a small brisk woman named Arun who ran a food cart near the station in the mornings, in November, about 6 weeks after our first meeting. Her mother spoke almost no English, and regarded me with an expression I could only read as cautious approval, the look of a woman who has learned not to celebrate prematurely. Her brother, whose name was Crit, was quieter, a heavy-set young man who shook my hand with both of his and said, in English, "She talk about you a lot." Her sisters, I didn't meet until later. The family home was a narrow row house not far from the station, the kind of tight, practical living arrangement that implies a precise management of limited resources, where the walls held photographs and the kitchen smelled of fish sauce, and everyone seemed to exist in close proximity to everyone else, without apparent friction. I liked it. I want to say that clearly. I liked what I saw. I found it warm in the specific way that dense family arrangements sometimes are, the communal warmth that large families in small spaces generate simply by existing together. By December, I had extended my stay twice, and was no longer thinking of it as a stay. I was thinking of it as a life. Kwan and I had talked, carefully and then not so carefully, about what the future might look like. I was not foolish enough to propose marriage over noodles on the 6th week, but I was having those conversations, the hypothetical becoming concrete conversations, the ones that begin, if someone were to live here, and end up meaning, when I live here. The exchange rate was comfortably in my favor. My pension, the monthly payment, separate from the lump sum, would come in at around £1,400 a month, which converted to something over 60,000 baht at the rates that December, which was a livable amount by any measure. The lump sum, sitting in my Halifax account, was security. It was the buffer. It was the thing that meant I wasn't dependent on anyone and couldn't be pressured by anyone, because whatever happened, I had it there. I should tell you about Ian. Ian was a man I'd met on my previous Bangkok trip, in 2017, an electrical contractor from Wigan who'd been living in Thailand for 7 years and who I looked up on a Facebook group for British expats and contacted when I arrived. We met for a beer in a bar in the Ari neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of bar that caters to older Western men who want a quiet drink and a television showing football. Ian was 59, thin and weathered in the way of men who've spent years in hot countries, with a permanently amused expression that occasionally became not amused. He asked how long I'd been there. I told him. He asked what I was doing. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me about a friend of his, a Scotsman named Alistair, who had retired to Pattaya 5 years earlier, met a woman, married her, put £200,000 into a house in her name because Thai law required it, and discovered 18 months later that she had a mortgage on the house for £70,000 that he had no knowledge of, and that she and her family had borrowed extensively against the property's value, and that legally he had no claim on any of it because his name wasn't on the deed. Alistair, Ian said, was living in a guest house in Udon Thani on his pension and wasn't talking to anyone much anymore. I listened to this story with the full attention of a man who has already decided it doesn't apply to him. I know that's what I was doing. I can tell you, in retrospect, the exact shape of my internal reasoning, because I was very aware of it at the time, in the way you're aware of it when you're doing it but calling it something else. I thought, Alistair sounds like a man who moved too fast. Alistair sounds like a man who didn't do his research. Alistair sounds like a man who met his woman in a bar. Ian hadn't specified this, but I'd assumed it. Rather than in the ordinary course of life, in a train station, talking about architecture. My situation was different because I was not Alistair. I was Walter. I was careful. I understood systems. I would do this properly. I thanked Ian for the story. I ordered another round. We talked about football. I never mentioned Kwan's name. We married the following April, in a ceremony at the district office in Bang Sue that took approximately 40 minutes and involved a great deal of paperwork, 2 of Kwan's sisters as witnesses, and a family celebration afterward at a restaurant near the station where Arun pressed food onto my plate, with the determined generosity of a woman who intends to ensure you never leave hungry. I wore a pale blue shirt. Kwan wore a fitted dress in deep rose pink that I can still see precisely if I close my eyes, which I try not to do. The photographs from that day are somewhere I don't look anymore. I should tell you something about the period between our first meeting and the wedding, because I've skipped over it too quickly, and the skipping is itself a kind of dishonesty. Those 6 months were not a sustained courtship of obvious intensity. They were something quieter and, I think, more effective than that. There were weeks when I barely saw Kwan because her work schedule ran long and her family needed things, and in those weeks I would find myself thinking about her with a regularity that told me something I was willing to hear. When we were together, the time was good in unspectacular ways. Walks, meals, the quiet occupation of shared space that feels comfortable rather than performed. She never asked for much. That matters. In my experience of how these stories are usually told, the stories of men who end up where I ended up, there's an early phase of extravagant demands, of escalating requests that should have triggered alarm. That wasn't how this went. What I was given, early on, was restraint. A woman who seemed to need very little, who deflected my offers as often as she accepted them, who said, "I'm fine, you don't need to," with enough frequency that I started to feel that paying for things was my idea rather than hers. That reframing, from her need to my generosity, is important. It meant that when things shifted, the shift was invisible against the background of what I'd already told myself about my own motivations. I also want to say this about the sin sod, the bride price, the traditional payment a groom makes to a bride's family. Kwan raised the subject herself, 4 months in, and did so with evident discomfort, explaining the custom carefully, in case I found it alien or offensive. I found it neither. I found it, in fact, entirely comprehensible, a formal acknowledgement of the family's loss and the groom's capacity to provide. We agreed on an amount, 200,000 baht, which at the time converted to roughly 4,700 pounds, and I paid it at a small family ceremony a month before the district office registration, cash in an envelope, presented to Arun, who received it with a nod that managed to convey both gratitude and the sense that she had expected nothing less. I remember thinking, as I handed the envelope over, that this was how things should work: transparent, acknowledged, mutual. It didn't occur to me then that the sin sod was the only financial transaction in the whole of our relationship that was conducted in the open, in front of witnesses, with explicit agreement from all parties. Every other movement of money came later, and quietly, and one at a time. The joint account, at a Thai bank, a Capricorn account, was Kwan's suggestion. Practical and sensible, she explained, for managing household expenses, without the friction of currency conversion, every time we needed to buy something. I transferred the equivalent of 340,000 pounds into it in 2 tranches over the course of that April and May, partly because the transfer limits my UK bank imposed required it to be staggered, and partly because I remember feeling, on the second transfer, a brief flicker of something I didn't pursue. Not doubt exactly. More like the sensation you get when you're almost certain you've left the gas on, but you're already at the station and the train is there, and you make the calculation, and you get on the train. I got on the train. She had told me, the week before the wedding, that her brother Krit needed surgery on his knee, a ligament problem from a football injury that had worsened, she said, and that the public hospital had a 3-month wait. The private hospital could do it in a fortnight. The cost, she said, hesitantly and with visible reluctance, was 85,000 baht, around 2,000 pounds at the time. I said, of course. I said, that's not a question, Kwan. Don't look like that, it's not a question. She looked at me with an expression of such obvious gratitude that I felt embarrassed to be thanked for something so trivial. That's what 2,000 pounds was to me then, trivial. A rounding error on a good pension. The kind of money you spend on a holiday without thinking about it. I want you to understand that, because it matters to what comes next. We had settled in her family's area, in Bang Sue, in a rented apartment on the 6th floor of a building that was clean and modern, and had a gym on the 2nd floor that I used twice. I was happy. I say that plainly and without irony. I was happy. The mornings were mine. I'd walk down to a coffee shop near the station and drink 2 cups of something strong and watch the city move. And the city was always moving, always generating the low-grade heat and energy of a place that hasn't decided to stop. I'd taken to carrying a small notebook to jot down observations, railway-related and otherwise, the habit of a man who spent his working life annotating margins. In the afternoons, Kwan and I would often go somewhere, a market, a temple, a park, and she was consistently good company, attentive, and funny in a dry way I'd come to expect and look forward to. In the evenings, we'd eat at the family place or at one of the restaurants near the apartment, and occasionally I would sit on the balcony with a small whiskey and watch the lights of the neighborhood and feel, as straightforwardly as I'd felt anything in years, that I was where I was supposed to be. The account I didn't check. That's the simple fact, and I'm going to say it plainly without mitigating it beyond what's accurate. I set up the direct payment of my pension from the UK into our joint account, and I did not look at the account with any regularity after that. I had a ballpark sense of what was in it. I knew I'd transferred the capital, and I knew the pension came in monthly, and I assumed, this is the crucial word, the word that opens the fault in the track. I assumed that if anything required my attention, Kwan would flag it. She managed the household finances. She paid the rent, the utilities, the grocery expenses. She had her name on the account alongside mine. She was my wife. I trusted the system to run itself the way I'd trusted systems to run themselves for 35 years. The first thing I noticed was the car. This was in the July after the wedding, so roughly 3 months after the account was funded. Kwan arrived home in a Toyota Fortuner that I'd not seen before, dark charcoal gray, not new but close to it, and explained that her friend had sold it to her at a good price, because the friend was leaving Bangkok for Chiang Rai and needed to liquidate quickly. I asked how much. She said 480,000 baht. I worked that out, at the July exchange rate, to be approximately 11,500 pounds. I remember thinking that was a reasonable price for what appeared to be a late-model SUV, and I remember thinking that she could have asked me about the purchase beforehand, and I remember consciously deciding not to make an issue of it because making an issue of it would feel like policing her, like treating my wife as someone who required my approval for her financial decisions, and that didn't fit with how I wanted to be in this marriage. That decision, the decision not to ask the question I almost asked, was, in retrospect, where things began in earnest. Through that summer, there was a sequence of what I can only describe, from the outside, as a rhythm. Kwan's mother's food cart had a leaking roof that needed repair. 45,000 baht. Her younger sister Tuck had a daughter who was starting at a private school with outstanding fees. 60,000 baht, to be repaid monthly. Her brother Krit, recovered from the surgery I'd funded, had an opportunity to invest in a small delivery franchise, needed 120,000 baht as a deposit, absolutely guaranteed to come back within 8 months. Each of these came to me as separate conversations, spaced weeks apart, always with a careful explanation, always with the apologetic preamble of a woman who hated having to ask, always resolved with my agreement, because none of the individual amounts was large enough, in isolation, to trigger the refusal mechanism in me. I can see now, as I write this, that the amounts were calibrated. Not precisely, I don't mean it was a spreadsheet operation, but intuitively, in the way that people who have been poor for a long time develop a sensitivity to the threshold at which comfortable people stop saying yes. They stayed well below my threshold. They always had a reason. They always came with a face that communicated both need and reluctance to impose. I want to be accurate about what I knew and when I knew it. There were moments. There was an afternoon in September when I overheard Kwan on the phone in the other room. She was speaking Thai, as she usually did with family, and I could only catch fragments. And I heard my name, something that sounded like it, followed by a number that I thought I recognized as a baht amount, and then a laugh. A quick, comfortable laugh, not the laugh of someone who knows they're being overheard, but the laugh of someone completely at ease. I stood in the kitchen and I thought, is she talking about the account? And then I thought, don't do this to yourself. Trust is not surveillance. You chose this. Act like you chose it. There was the evening in October when I mentioned, casually, that I should probably look at the account balance, And she said, equally casually, that she'd sorted everything this month and there was plenty. And then she asked me what I wanted for dinner, and the conversation went somewhere else. And I let it go somewhere else. And I didn't look at the account. I can't tell you why, precisely, beyond the explanation I've already offered. I had built the habit of trusting the system. The system was Kwan. Kwan said it was fine. I believe now that she understood my psychology with considerable precision, that a man who has spent his career trusting mechanisms to operate without his constant intervention will, when told by the mechanism that everything is functioning normally, return to his default setting of not checking. She knew that because I had, in essence, told her so. I had told her about the railways, about the 35 years, about what I'd believed in. I had handed her the map. By November, I noticed she was home less. This is the kind of observation that, described plainly, sounds dramatic, but in the living of it was not dramatic at all. It was quiet. She had more errands, more time at her mother's, more evening commitments with friends I'd met vaguely or not at all. She was not cold, not in any way that I could articulate as a change, but she was somehow less present in the apartment, even when she was physically in it, her phone requiring more of her attention, her conversations drifting. I told myself she was managing family affairs. I told myself this was normal in a Thai family context, that the web of obligations was complex, and she was a dutiful daughter and sister. I told myself that not everything needed to be shared with me, that I wasn't the kind of husband who demanded accounting for every hour. Then in December she told me her mother had been diagnosed with a liver condition. Not serious, she said, but requiring medication that the standard coverage didn't fully address. Another 30,000 baht a month for the foreseeable. I said yes. Of course. And then I said, and this is the first time I said anything that approached the proximity of a question, I said perhaps I should look at the account, to see how we're sitting. She said yes, of course, any time, and then there was a call on her phone that she needed to take, and the account conversation dissolved, and we didn't return to it that evening, and I told myself I'd look in the morning. I didn't look in the morning. I'm not sure why. I think by that point I had developed some superstition about looking. As if by checking the balance I would be testing the thing, measuring the trust, introducing a doubt that looking would confirm. The way you sometimes don't check a letter if you're afraid of what's in it. I was not afraid, I told myself. I just wasn't in a hurry. The statement arrived in February. I'd set up the account to receive paper statements because I am a man of a certain generation who distrusts a digital trail he can't hold in his hands. And I want to be clear that paper statement was the only reason I found out when I did. Without it, I'm not sure how much longer I might have gone on. The envelope came on a Tuesday morning while Kwan was at her mother's, and I opened it at the kitchen table with the ceiling fan clicking above me and the light coming in flat and white from the northeast, and a cup of tea going cold beside my elbow. The closing balance was 847,000 baht. I need you to understand what that means in context. I had deposited the equivalent of 340,000 pounds into that account in April and May of the previous year. At the exchange rate of that period, that was approximately 14,300,000 baht. My pension had been coming in monthly, around 60,000 baht a month. By February, I'd received 9 months of pension payments since the account opened, adding approximately 540,000 baht. So the account should have held, after the household expenses I was aware of, somewhere in the region of 12 million to 13 million baht. It held 847,000 baht, which at the February exchange rate was approximately 20,000 pounds. My hands were not shaking. I've thought about that since. They weren't shaking because I think part of me had understood, on some register below the one I'd been listening to, for quite some time. I sat with the statement for a long while. I turned it over and looked at the back, which was blank. Then I turned it back to the front. I looked at the transaction history, which took up 3 full printed pages in a font small enough to require my glasses. The pattern was unmistakable when you looked at it from the outside. It is only not unmistakable from the inside, when you are standing in the middle of it and each individual transaction has been given a name. The brother's surgery, the mother's cart roof, the school fees, the franchise deposit, the medication. And you've agreed to each name individually, and you haven't added them up because adding them up would mean something you've chosen not to let it mean. There were transfers I hadn't agreed to. That was the other thing. Transfers I had no name for, no conversation associated with, no memory of being consulted. Regular transfers, varying in size, to an account number I didn't recognize, occurring roughly twice a month from the moment the account opened. Not large enough individually to make a noise. Not small enough in aggregate to be anything innocent. I put the statement down and picked up my tea, which was cold. I drank it anyway. The ceiling fan clicked. I thought about Alistair in Udon Thani, whom I'd never met, whose story I'd sat in a bar and listened to with the comfortable disbelief of a man who is very sure he isn't Alistair. I called Kwan. She answered on the third ring, and her voice was normal, the ordinary voice of a wife who expects an ordinary question. I told her the statement had come. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and told me everything the statement hadn't. She came home an hour later. I had the pages laid out on the kitchen table by then, in order. She looked at them and then at me, and her face went through several things in quick succession, a calculation, I think, of what I knew versus what I didn't. And then she sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. I asked her about the transfers to the account I didn't recognize. She said it was her account, a personal account, from before we married. I asked why money was being transferred to it from our joint account on a regular schedule, without my knowledge. She said she needed some money of her own. She said I wouldn't understand. I said, try me. She said that in Thai families, the woman manages the finances, and she was managing the finances, and if I'd wanted to be involved, I should have said so at the beginning. I said the beginning was when she suggested the joint account and told me she'd manage the household expenses. She said that was what she'd done, managing the household. Then I told her the total. I'd done the calculation on a notepad while I was waiting for her. The opening deposits, the incoming pension, the closing balance, the deficit. 13,421,000 baht. Adjusted for the household bills I had documentation for. She looked at the number on my notepad and said I was wrong, that my calculation was wrong, that the exchange rates weren't right, that I was confused. Her voice was measured, not panicked. That measured quality, the absence of alarm in a person confronted with an alarm, told me more than the bank statement had. I asked about her mother's medication. She said, what about it? I said the medication had been costing 30,000 baht a month for 4 months. She said yes. I asked if I could see the pharmacy receipts. She said she didn't keep receipts. I asked about Krit's franchise deposit. She said the business hadn't worked out. I asked when. She said recently. I asked why she hadn't mentioned that to me. She said I didn't need to worry about things like that. I want to tell you what her voice was like in this conversation, because I think it matters. She wasn't angry, not at the beginning. She was patient with me in the way that people are patient with someone they believe they can still manage. She kept her hands folded on the table, and she looked at me steadily, and she spoke in the tone of a person explaining something to someone who is slightly slow on the uptake. Not cruel, but not warm either. The performance of reasonableness that isn't reasonable at all. At some point I said the words 12 million baht, and something shifted in her face, and she said, "You think I steal from you. You think like that. Like I am criminal." And I said, I didn't think she was a criminal. I was asking her to help me understand where the money had gone. She stood up from the table and said I didn't trust her. She said this is why Thai Farang marriages don't work, because Farang don't understand that family is everything, and you can't put a price on family. She said that and she meant it, I think in the specific sense that she had decided the family's financial needs were legitimate, and my oversight of those needs was not. I called Ian the next morning. I called him from the balcony, which felt somehow more appropriate than calling from inside. The open air, the noise of the city below, the sky a flat pale blue with thin cloud. Ian answered immediately, as though he'd been waiting, which I don't think he had. He just answers quickly. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You need a lawyer today, not tomorrow." The lawyer Ian recommended was a Thai woman named Kulap, who operated out of offices near Victory Monument and who had, I gathered from Ian's description, handled several cases very similar to mine. She was brisk and professional and spoke excellent English and was, I noticed, entirely without the flinching sympathy that I would have found intolerable. She looked at the statement, asked me several questions, and told me what I already understood, but needed to hear from someone with professional authority. The money in the joint account, once deposited, belonged to both of us. The transfers Kwan had made to her personal account were legally hers to make. I had given her full access, and she had exercised it, without documented fraud or forgery, neither of which I could currently demonstrate. My legal position was extremely weak. She said this without apology, and I respected her for it. I went back to the apartment, and I sat on the balcony with a bottle of Johnny Walker Red that I hadn't opened since New Year's, and I did the full arithmetic. Not just the account deficit, but everything. The Fortuner that Kwan was still driving, 480,000 baht, approximately 11,500 pounds. The transfers I had agreed to, the surgery, the cart roof, the school fees, the franchise, the medication. I added those up for the first time, all of them together, and the total was 2,140,000 baht, roughly 51,000 pounds. The transfers I hadn't agreed to, the regular withdrawals to her personal account that stretched back to the month the account opened, represented approximately 11,400,000 baht, which converted to 272,000 pounds at an average exchange rate, give or take. And there was my pension, 9 months of it, approximately 12,600 pounds, that had been absorbed into the account and was part of the general evaporation. Total, 340,000 pounds, give or take a few hundred. 35 years of railway pension contributions and a house I'd lived in alone since my divorce, and the entire lump sum I'd managed to accumulate in a working life that had never had much room for excess. Gone. Managed out of existence. 847,000 baht at a time, in a pattern her mother had apparently helped design, keeping the individual amounts small enough that a man who trusted systems wouldn't feel the weight until the system had nothing left to run on. I called my daughter Laura in Leeds. Laura is 39 and works in NHS administration, and is, like her mother, a person of considerable practical competence and limited patience for failure. I had not told her I was married. I realize how that sounds. I had told her I was in Thailand and happy, which is different from nothing, but I had not found the moment to explain Kwan, partly because I knew what Laura would think, and partly because explaining Kwan would have required me to acknowledge, even in passing, that I knew what Laura would think. She answered the phone with her usual directness. "Dad, you're ringing at 6:30 in the morning. Are you all right?" And I told her. All of it. From the station to the statement. I did not edit. The silence that followed was the silence of a person processing information they had been, on some level, waiting for. Not the silence of surprise, but the silence of confirmation. "I want you to come home," she said finally. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but I want you to come home." I told her I couldn't come home yet. There were things I needed to try. She said, "What things?" I couldn't answer that well. I tried. I want to say that because it's true. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to find an avenue, through Kulap, through a second lawyer Ian recommended, through conversations with Kwan that became less and less like conversations and more like archaeological exercises. 2 people digging for a foundation that turned out not to be there. Kwan continued to live in the apartment for most of this period, in a state of what I can only describe as deliberate normalcy. She cooked, she watched television, she came and went at hours I couldn't always account for, and the combination of her presence and the wreckage of what I knew was more disorienting than I can adequately describe. I asked her once, near the end of that period, sitting in the kitchen with the fan clicking above us, if she had loved me. She looked at me for a long time before she said anything. Then she said, "I thought this would be different." I don't know exactly what she meant by that. I've turned it over many times. I left Bangkok on a Wednesday in March. I booked a flight to Heathrow on the Tuesday night on my phone, sitting on the balcony with what was left of the whiskey, watching the neighborhood lights. The account had enough in it to buy the ticket and leave me a small cushion. My pension still came in, and always would. I packed 2 bags, the things I'd brought from Beeston, plus a few items I'd acquired in Thailand, and I left the rest. The blue polo shirt that Kwan had bought me for my birthday was in the wardrobe. I looked at it for a moment, and then I closed the wardrobe, and I didn't open it again. Kwan was at her mother's when I left. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I took the BTS to the airport rail link and the rail link to Suvarnabhumi, and I sat in the departure lounge for 4 hours before my flight, and I looked at the departure boards with a feeling I could not name cleanly. Something between grief and relief, and the particular flatness that follows a long, sustained effort of not knowing something you have known for some time. I live in a flat in Wakefield now, renting from the council at a rate that my pension covers and a small amount over. I am 72 years old, and I have approximately £20,000 to my name. Laura comes to visit on alternate Sundays and brings food, which I accept, because refusing it would be unkind, and also because I've lost whatever stubbornness drove me to refuse kindness for most of my adult life. I walk in the mornings. I read. I watch the trains go through from a footbridge near the flat, and I think about systems and how they work, and what happens when the thing you put your trust in is not the thing you think it is. I don't know what Kwan is doing now. I don't look. There's no version of looking that would be good for me. And I've learned, late, expensively, with interest, to identify which things are bad for me and stop doing them. What I want to say to you, to the person watching this, the person who has got this far, is not what most people say at the end of stories like mine. Most people say, don't trust young Thai women, or don't trust anyone who's much younger than you, or I was stupid and you're smarter than I was. Those lessons are too simple. The real lesson is quieter and less flattering. The real lesson is that I understood exactly what a system run on trust requires. I understood it professionally. I built a career on it. And I took that understanding, the understanding that you must perform regular checks, that you must never assume a system is functioning simply because no alarm has sounded, that faults propagate silently until they cannot be ignored. And I set it aside, deliberately, because checking would have meant I didn't trust her, and I needed to trust her more than I needed to know the truth. You cannot opt out of oversight, because oversight feels like doubt. Doubt is the mechanism. The check is the point. 35 years of railway engineering taught me that the schedule and the spot check are not opposites of trust. They are what trust is made of. I forgot that the moment it was personal. Check the account. Check it every month. Check it the way you'd check the track before you put a train on it. Not because the person you love is dishonest, but because you owe that much to yourself, to the work you did, to the life you're trying to build. The machinery of trust does not run itself. I know that better than anyone. The fan in that Bangkok apartment is still clicking, probably. Someone should fix it. They won't.